The Johnsons had always dreamed of adopting a dog, picturing the joyful chaos of a furry companion bounding through their home. When they first laid eyes on Max, a golden retriever with warm brown eyes and an eager, wagging tail, they knew he was meant to be part of their family. The shelter volunteer had assured them he was a sweetheart, gentle, intelligent, and perfect for a home with children. From the moment Max stepped into their house, he settled in effortlessly. He took to their toddler, Lily, immediately, following her around like a protective shadow. Even Sarah, who had initially worried about the extra responsibility, found herself enchanted by the way Max would rest his head on her lap while she read in the evenings. Mark, always pragmatic, was simply relieved that Max was house-trained. At first, everything seemed perfect, but then the strange behavior began. It started subtly, barely enough to notice. Every night, as the family settled into bed, Max would position himself at the foot of Sarah and Mark's bed, his golden coat blending with the dim light of their bedroom. Instead of curling up to sleep, he would sit completely still, his ears perked, his eyes fixed on them. He didn't whimper or move, he just watched. At first, Sarah brushed it off. "Maybe he's just adjusting," she told Mark one night as she turned off the lamp. Mark, half asleep already, mumbled, "Dogs are weird." But Max's behavior didn't change. Each night, he remained in that eerie, unmoving vigil, his gaze never shifting away from the couple. It was unsettling. Sarah found herself waking up at odd hours, sensing something watching her before realizing it was only Max. One night, around 2 a.m., she stirred from a restless sleep. The room was dark except for the faint silver glow of moonlight spilling through the curtains. She turned her head, and there he was, sitting upright, his gaze locked on her. Her pulse quickened. "Max," she whispered. He didn't respond. She sat up slowly, expecting him to at least wag his tail, but he remained completely still, his eyes darker in the shadows. A chill ran through her. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers grazing the soft fur on his head. "What is it, boy?" The moment she touched him, he let out a low, almost inaudible growl. Not aggressive, but wary. Protective. Sarah's breath caught. She glanced toward the bedroom door, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing there. But there was nothing. The house was silent. She lay back down, pulling the covers tighter around herself, telling herself she was overreacting. But sleep did not come easily. The next morning at breakfast, Sarah brought it up casually. "Have you noticed how Max stares at us while we sleep?" Mark, distracted by his phone, barely looked up. "Dogs stare. It's a thing. Maybe he's just waiting for us to wake up." Lily, happily munching on her cereal, suddenly giggled. "Max listens to the whispers." Sarah turned to her. "What whispers, sweetheart?" Lily shrugged, swinging her legs beneath the table. "The night whispers." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. "Where do you hear whispers?" Lily looked at her as if the answer were obvious. "From the closet." Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance. The closet. The one Max always seemed to face when he wasn't staring at them. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the unease. She and Mark went through their usual bedtime routine, but when she lay down, she felt restless. She tried to ignore Max, who had already assumed his usual post at the foot of the bed. An hour passed. 2. Sleep remained elusive. Then she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper. She sat up so quickly that Mark stirred beside her. "What?" he murmured groggily. Sarah strained to listen, heart hammering. The sound was coming from the closet. She reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight, casting a beam of light across the room. The closet door stood slightly ajar. A thin sliver of darkness gaped between the wood. "Max was staring at it again," she whispered to Mark. Lily said. Before she could finish, Max let out a sudden, sharp bark, his fur bristling. He turned toward the closet, his growl low and rumbling. Sarah's fingers tightened around Mark's arm. "You heard that, right?" Mark sat up now, fully awake. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice low. He grabbed the bedside lamp, raising it as if it were a weapon. Slowly, he swung his legs over the bed and walked toward the closet. Max followed, growling louder. Mark hesitated before gripping the doorknob. "It's probably nothing," he said, but Sarah heard the doubt in his voice. He yanked the door open. Nothing. Clothes hung neatly, undisturbed. The storage boxes on the floor remained untouched. There was no explanation for the sound. Still, Max didn't relax. He stood rigid, staring into the closet as if expecting something to emerge. Mark sighed. "See? Nothing." But Sarah wasn't so sure. Max didn't move from the closet for the rest of the night. When she woke up in the morning, he was still sitting there, wide awake, watching. The tension in the house had shifted. Sarah could feel it in the way the air seemed heavier at night, in the way Max refused to let his guard down. His behavior wasn't just strange anymore, it was deliberate, watchful, protective. During the day, he was his usual self, playful and affectionate, but the moment dusk fell, he became a different animal. His movements slowed, his ears twitched at the slightest sound, and his focus narrowed. Sarah started keeping track of his habits. Each night, without fail, he positioned himself in front of the closet before slowly shifting his gaze to the bed. If she or Mark stirred, his eyes would snap toward them, as if checking to see if they had noticed something he had. It was beginning to wear on her. "Mark, something's not right," she said one evening as they got ready for bed. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sarah, we've checked the closet a dozen times. There's nothing there." "Then why does he act like there is?" Mark hesitated, then shook his head. "Dogs are weird. Maybe he hears something in the walls. Old pipes, creaky wood. We've had the house for years, but maybe he's just more sensitive to it." Sarah didn't buy it. Later that night, after Mark had fallen asleep, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the bedside clock. She could feel Max's presence without even looking. Then, the whisper came again. This time it was clearer. Not the usual creak of a settling house, not the rustle of tree branches against the window. It was a voice. A breathy, low murmur. Indistinct, but unmistakably human. Sarah's pulse pounded. She forced herself to sit up, scanning the darkened room. The closet door was slightly open. Hadn't she shut it before bed? Max growled. It was low and deep, vibrating through the air like a warning. Sarah held her breath. Then, ever so slowly, the closet door creaked open another inch. She swallowed hard. Her first instinct was to wake Mark, but something about the moment felt fragile, like a single movement would shatter the barrier between her and whatever was lurking beyond that door. Max stood up. His fur bristled, and his teeth glinted in the dim light. Sarah's heart pounded as she reached for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers trembling. She turned on the flashlight, aiming the beam directly at the closet. Nothing. The clothes hung limply, the storage boxes sat untouched. Max stepped forward. His paws were silent against the wooden floor, but his posture was rigid. He was staring, not at the clothes, but at the floor. Sarah followed his gaze, and that's when she saw it. The floorboard near the back of the closet had shifted slightly. Just enough to be noticeable if you were looking closely. She had lived in this house for years. That board had never been loose before. Slowly, cautiously, she climbed out of bed and approached the closet, the phone light trembling in her grasp. Max remained at her side, his body pressed close to her leg. She knelt down and reached for the board. It lifted far too easily. Her stomach nodded. A cold draft drifted upward from the darkness below. A space beneath the floor. A hidden compartment. Sarah's breath hitched. She hesitated only for a moment before aiming the light down into the opening. There, nestled within the shadows, was something small. A box. Her fingers trembled as she reached inside and pulled it out. It was wooden, old, with deep scratches along its surface. The metal latch had rusted slightly, but it was still intact. She turned toward Max. His eyes never left the box. Sarah's mind raced. Had the previous owners left this here? Why had Max been so fixated on this exact spot? She took a deep breath and pried the latch open. Inside, there were photographs, black and white, faded with age. The first showed a family standing in front of the very house she now lived in. A man, a woman, and a child. Sarah's fingers brushed against something underneath the photos. A letter, yellowed with time. She unfolded it carefully, squinting at the slanted handwriting. _ They watch from the dark. I hear them at night. I lock the door, but it does not matter. I don't know how much longer we have before they come for us. If you find this, leave. Leave before it's too late. _ Sarah's blood ran cold. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the words, her hands gripping the fragile paper so tightly it nearly tore. Max let out a sharp, sudden bark. Sarah's head snapped up. Something moved in the closet. Not a trick of the light. Not a shifting shadow. Something was in there. Watching. She staggered backward, slamming the box shut. Max growled again, louder this time, his body tense. From behind her, Mark groaned groggily. Sarah? What are you doing? She couldn't answer. Couldn't move. The whispering returned. Louder. Closer. And then, the closet door slammed shut. The air in the bedroom felt thick, suffocating. The sudden force with which the closet door had slammed sent a tremor through Sarah's body. The house had never felt this alive before, this watchful. Mark groaned again, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. Sarah, what the hell is going on? She barely registered his voice. Her heart pounded like a war drum, her skin clammy as she clutched the box against her chest. Max stood rigid in front of her, his growl a continuous, warning snarl. She swallowed hard. The closet. Something's in there. Mark blinked, still groggy. What are you talking about? She didn't answer. Instead, she thrust the box toward him with trembling hands. This was under the floor. There's a letter inside. Read it. Mark frowned, taking the letter and skimming the lines. His expression shifted from confusion to unease, his fingers tightening around the fragile paper. What is this? He muttered, glancing at the closet. I don't know, Sarah whispered. But Max does. The dog didn't move. His body was coiled tight, his teeth bared. He wasn't just reacting to fear. He was preparing for something. Mark swung his legs over the bed, exhaling sharply. Okay. This is ridiculous. I'm checking. No, Sarah said quickly, grabbing his arm. Don't. Mark shook her off. It's our closet, Sarah. There's nothing in there. He marched across the room before she could stop him, his fingers curling around the door handle. Sarah braced herself, every muscle locked as she gripped Max's collar. Mark yanked the door open. Silence. The closet was empty. The clothes hung undisturbed, the storage boxes untouched. It looked just as it always had. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. See? Nothing. Sarah's body refused to relax. The oppressive air, the feeling of being watched, it was still there. And Max hadn't budged an inch. He was still staring. Not at the closet, but at the back wall. Sarah felt the chill before she saw it. A subtle draft, creeping along her skin like icy fingers. Mark must have felt it too, because his forehead creased. He stepped deeper inside, placing his hand against the wooden panel. His eyes flicked toward Sarah. There's air coming through. Sarah's throat went dry. What? He knocked lightly on the wall. It sounded hollow. A hidden space. Mark pressed his lips into a thin line, then pushed against the panel. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a low creak, the wood gave way. A gap formed, a narrow passage beyond the closet. Darkness stretched past it, consuming everything beyond the threshold. The draft was stronger now, carrying with it a damp, earthy scent. Sarah's stomach churned. There's something back there, Mark muttered. No, Sarah whispered, shaking her head. We're not doing this. Close it. But Mark was already reaching for his phone, flicking on the flashlight. Just a quick look, he said. Maybe it's just an old crawlspace or... A thud. Sarah jolted. The sound hadn't come from them. It had come from inside the passage. Mark froze. Max let out a low, guttural snarl. His fur bristled along his spine, his eyes locked onto the opening. Another thud. Closer this time. A footstep. Sarah's breath hitched. No. No, no, no. Mark took a step back, his flashlight shaking slightly. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, but for a split second, just a flicker, Sarah thought she saw something move. Something low. Crawling. She grabbed Mark's arm. Close it. He didn't argue. His hands scrambled against the panel, pushing with all his weight. The wood groaned, resisting for a moment before finally snapping back into place. Silence returned. Max stayed where he was, his eyes never leaving the wall. His growl had stopped, but his ears remained pricked, his body alert. Mark let out a breath. What the hell was that? Sarah shook her head, unable to find words. Then, the whisper returned. Not from inside the closet. Not from the passage. From the baby monitor. Sarah's head snapped toward the nightstand. The small screen, which had been quiet all night, flickered with static. Then, soft, broken breathing. A voice. Not their babies. A whisper, slow and deliberate. I see you. Sarah screamed. Max lunged toward the monitor, barking furiously. Mark grabbed the device, his hands fumbling as he slammed the power button. The screen went black. Sarah was shaking. That wasn't. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed her wrist. We're leaving. Now. She didn't argue. Within minutes, they had the baby in the car, Max jumping in after them. Mark didn't even stop to pack. They needed to get out. As the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, Sarah's chest remained tight. The weight of something unseen still pressed against her skin. But Max? He finally relaxed. As if, for the first time since they brought him home, he knew they were safe. The night air was thick with silence, broken only by the hum of the car's engine. Sarah clutched the baby against her chest, her pulse still erratic. Mark's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his jaw set in rigid determination. Max lay in the back seat, his body curled protectively around the infant carrier. His ears twitched at every passing shadow, but for the first time in days, he wasn't growling. We need to call someone, Sarah whispered. Mark didn't take his eyes off the road. Who? The police? What do we even say? That our dog found a hidden room in our house, and something inside whispered to us? Sarah's throat tightened. It sounded insane when spoken aloud. But it had happened. Mark exhaled sharply. We'll go to a hotel. Figure this out in the morning. Sarah nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed that they weren't safe. Not yet. Whatever was in that house, it hadn't just been confined to the closet. It had reached through the baby monitor, spoken to them. It had seen them. The hotel was a small, roadside inn, barely occupied. Mark checked in while Sarah stayed in the car, unwilling to let go of their son. When he returned, he carried a single key and a look of exhaustion. Room 108. End of the hall. They moved quickly, slipping into the dimly lit room. Mark locked the door behind them, bolting it twice before dragging a chair in front of it. Sarah placed the baby in the crib provided by the hotel, her hands lingering over his tiny frame. The weight of the past few days threatened to crush her. Mark sat on the bed, rubbing his face. We need answers. Sarah swallowed. The letter. He looked at her. She hesitated, then reached into the diaper bag where she had stashed the old, crumpled paper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The words were written in hurried, uneven strokes aged with time. If you've found this, leave immediately. It sees you. It follows. It waits for the baby. It will never stop. Sarah's breath shuddered. It was never about us. Mark's expression darkened. It wanted our son. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from behind them. Sarah turned so fast her neck ached. Max stood rigid, his teeth bared. His entire body bristled as he stared at the baby monitor on the nightstand. It was off, unplugged, but the screen flickered, and the whisper returned. Why did you leave? Sarah's scream caught in her throat. The crib rattled violently. The baby let out a wail. Max lunged. The screen of the monitor exploded in a burst of static, sparks flying. The room plunged into a suffocating silence, thick and unnatural. Sarah barely had time to reach for her son before the overhead light flickered, once, twice, then burst. Darkness swallowed them whole. Max barked furiously, his body shifting between them and the crib. Mark grabbed Sarah's wrist, pulling her toward the door. Go, go! The air felt heavier, pressing against them, as if something unseen lurked just beyond reach. Sarah fumbled with the lock, her fingers slick with sweat. Mark threw the chair aside, yanking the door open. The hallway was empty. They ran. The baby wailed against Sarah's chest, but she held on tight, sprinting toward the exit. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed behind them, though when she turned there was nothing. Nothing but the creeping shadow that stretched unnaturally long against the dimly lit walls. Mark shoved open the main doors, the rush of cold night air slamming into them. Max was the last to leave. He paused at the threshold, staring back at the darkness inside. Then he snarled, low and final, before stepping out. The moment his paws touched the pavement, the hotel lights flickered, then cut out completely. A single, piercing shriek echoed from within. Then silence. Sarah couldn't breathe. Mark's chest heaved, his hand gripping her shoulder. Max stood tall, his body still rigid, his eyes locked on the building. Then, slowly, his tail wagged once. Just once. As if he knew it was over. For now.